The shed door was not supposed to be open. Reed Calloway noticed it from 30 meters away, the latch swinging loose, banging against the frame in the wind. The iron storm had been building since noon, and now the sky above Duskfall Station was the color of a bruise, all purple and sick green where the charged clouds rolled over each other. He pulled his coat tighter and walked toward the shed. He was not afraid. Fear was something Reed had spent a long time leaving behind. 15 years hauling cargo between fringe worlds had a way of sanding that particular feeling down to almost nothing. What lived in its place was something simpler and more useful, a habit of paying attention. He pushed the shed door fully open. The first thing he saw was light, not the flicker of his work lamp, which had no reason to be on. This light was soft and warm, like the last 20 minutes of sunset pressed into a single point. It came from the corner behind his spare fuel couplings, behind the stacked crates of sealing compound, from something curled up tight against the wall. Reed stood still. The thing was small, roughly the size of a large dog, but its shape was wrong for that. Wrong in a way that took a few seconds to process. Wings, folded flat and trembling, a tail curled around its own body like it was trying to hold itself together. Scales the color of old gold with threads of violet running through them, and those scales were glowing, faintly, unevenly, the way a light does when the power feeding it is almost gone. It had its eyes shut. One of its front legs was pulled in at an angle that did not look right. Reed did not move for a long moment. The wind outside picked up and rattled the shed walls. The creature flinched at the noise, but did not open its eyes. Its breathing was fast and shallow, the glow in its scales dipping with each exhale. He thought about his comms unit. He could call the colony hub. He could call Administrator Sable. He could close the shed door, go back inside, and let someone else figure this out. He looked at the leg. He went back to his house, got his first aid kit, the heavy one he kept from his hauler days, and came back. It took him a while to get close. The creature was clearly distressed, and he moved slowly, the way he used to approach the feral dogs that sometimes got into cargo bays on Port Mendes. Low, quiet, no sudden movements. He talked while he moved, just low words, nothing that meant anything, just sound. The creature opened its eyes when he was about 2 meters away. They were amber, not glowing. Just amber, the color of resin with the light behind it, and they were watching him with an intelligence that sat in his chest like a stone. It did not move to flee. It did not make a sound. It just watched him. Reed crouched down and waited. After a long time, maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5, the creature lowered its head back toward the ground. Not a retreat, more like a decision. He cleaned the leg as best he could. There was a deep cut along the joint, already showing signs of some reaction from whatever it had dragged itself through to get here. He used the wound sealant and wrapped what he could. The creature made a sound once, low, strained, not a scream but close to one, and then went still and let him finish. He brought it inside. He did not think too hard about that part. It was injured, the storm was coming, and the shed was not insulated. Those were the only facts that mattered. He made a space on the floor near the heating unit, put down the old cargo blankets, and set out water and what food he had that did not look like it would hurt a creature he knew nothing about. Cooked grain, some dried protein strips, a bowl of plain broth. The creature drank the broth, all of it slowly, watching him over the rim of the bowl. Reed sat in his chair and read his book. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, the storm hit in full. The lights flickered, the walls groaned. Outside, something in the yard tipped over and rolled. The creature made a small sound each time the thunder hit close, a sound Reed had no name for, and each time he said, without looking up from the page, "Still here. It's just the weather." He did not know if it understood, but the sounds stopped. He fell asleep in the chair. When he woke, it was early. The storm had passed. Gray light was coming through the window, and the heating unit was still running, and the creature had moved during the night. It was on his chest, curled there, small and warm, scales dimmed to almost no glow at all, breathing slow and even against his collarbone. One of its front claws was loosely hooked into the fabric of his shirt, just holding on. Reed looked at the ceiling for a while. Then his comms unit lit up. 47 messages, all priority red. The colony emergency channel was active, something he had never seen turned on in 11 years of living on Duskfall. And under all of it, a single broadcast on the open conclave frequency, repeating on loop in 6 languages. The last language was Human Standard. He read it. Then he looked down at the creature on his chest, who had opened its amber eyes and was looking back at him with that same quiet, waiting intelligence. "Well," Reed said, "you could have mentioned that." It blinked once slowly. He reached for the comms unit. Sergeant Brine picked up on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he already knew. "Don't talk," Brine said, "just listen." Reed leaned back in his chair. The creature, still on his chest, apparently with no intention of moving, made a small sound at the shift in his posture. He put one hand on its back, flat and still, and it settled again. "You have an auric worm," Brine said. Reed had never heard those words before. He said nothing. "Gold scales, violet threads, glows when it breathes. Tell me that's not what you're looking at." "I'm looking at it," Reed said. Brine made the noise he made when things were worse than he'd hoped. "The Conclave Harvest Authority has a ship in orbit. Director Olvin came herself. Do you know how rarely that woman leaves Conclave Central? The last time she went to a field operation was 7 years ago, and that was a species rights crisis on Reldova. She doesn't show up for small problems." Reed looked at the creature. It was watching him. He wondered if it could understand what was being said. He suspected the answer was yes. "What are they?" Reed asked. "The worms." "Priceless," Brine said. "Their scales hold a charge better than any synthetic material the Conclave has ever built. Their breath glands produce a compound that 3 different medical industries have built entire product lines around. And there's something biological, a bonding thing. Nobody talks about it much. They bond to a single individual. That makes them easier to handle in captivity, supposedly. What happens to the ones that don't bond?" Brine was quiet for a moment too long. "They don't survive long." "And the ones that do bond?" "Reed." "What happens to them, Brine?" "Handler is separated from the worm once it's been processed. The Conclave classifies the details. What I know is that the handlers don't tend to surface in public record afterward." A pause. "The Conclave's been running harvesting operations for 40 years. Wild auric worms were declared functionally extinct 30 years ago. What they have in their facilities is all that's left, and this one escaped from a Conclave transport 3 days ago. Every bounty hunter in the Olin Reach has her signal." Reed looked at the violet threads in the creature's scales. They were glowing a little warmer now, not distress, something else, something almost like comfort. "They're tracking her by the glow," Reed said. "Bioluminescent signature, unique per individual. They can triangulate within 100 meters. You need to turn her in, Reed. I'm saying this as someone who doesn't want you to, but you need to understand what's outside your perimeter right now." Reed crossed to the window and looked out. 3 ships had landed at the colony's edge. Not Conclave, private. Bounty craft, the kind that ran with no identifying marks and filed transit logs after the fact, if at all. 2 more were coming down from the east, lights visible through the last of the storm clouds. "How long before Olvin moves on the colony?" "She needs the colony administrator's sign-off to enter private property under the treaty. Sable won't give it easily, but she can go around Sable if she decides this is a treaty violation. And she will decide that, Reed, as soon as it's convenient." Reed let the curtain fall back. He turned around. The creature had lifted its head and was watching him from across the room, and for a moment the glow in its scales went very steady and bright, like something confirming itself. "I need to dampen the signal," Reed said. "How long would that buy me?" "If you can do it, hours, maybe more, but Reed." "I know," Reed said. "I know what I'm doing." He closed the comms. He spent the next 40 minutes going through his salvage. He had been a cargo hauler for 15 years, and before that a freight engineer, and before that a boy who learned to fix things because nobody else would. He knew what a bioluminescent signal ran on a passive organic broadcast, similar in structure to a standard comms frequency, just biological. He knew what disrupted it. He had two of the components already. He built the rest. The creature followed him around the workshop, hobbling slightly on the wrapped leg, staying close, watching everything he did with those amber eyes that held too much in them for something that small. He was halfway through the calibration when it happened. The conclave broadcast went to open channel, not just the colonial comms, but the physical sound system that Duskfall Station used for weather warnings. Olvain's voice came in through the air itself, translated in real time. Attention residents of Duskfall Station. The creature currently located in this settlement is the lawful property of the Conclave Harvest Authority under Biological Asset Charter 9. Any individual sheltering this creature is in direct violation of Accord Treaty 7. Violation carries penalty of full asset seizure and indefinite detainment. Surrender of the creature to Conclave representatives within 2 hours will result in no penalty to the sheltering individual. This offer does not extend beyond the stated window. It ended. The creature sat down on Reed's boot, just sat down on it, like that was a thing it had decided to do, and looked up at him. Reed looked down at her. She had come through a storm. She had let a stranger clean her wound. She had drunk his broth and slept on his chest, and now she was sitting on his boot while the Conclave broadcast her capture order across the colony's emergency system. Solara, he said, not for any particular reason, just a sound. Her scales lit up, not the dim survival glow, not the distress flicker, something brighter, something like recognition. He could not take it back after that. He did not try. He finished the dampener and switched it on. Outside, the bounty ships stopped moving. He watched them through the window, lights still, engines idling, suddenly without direction. He had bought himself time. He still had no idea what to do with it. The file arrived 3 hours after dawn, buried in a data packet from Brine, compressed, encrypted, flagged with no label. Reed opened it on his secondary screen, the one in the back room, while Solara slept on the cargo blankets with her head tucked under her good wing. It was a Conclave biological document. Old, dated 41 years ago, marked with the seal of the Conclave Department of Living Assets, which had since been renamed twice, and its records moved into restricted archive. Reed was not a scientist. He read slowly. He went back over sections twice when they didn't make sense, and a third time when they made too much sense. The auric worm bonding process was not gradual. It was not something that developed over weeks of contact and trust. It was a single biological event triggered by one specific condition, the worm's first moment of complete vulnerability and the choice made by whoever was present in that moment. If the individual stayed, if they helped, if they did not flee or hand the worm off to someone else, the bond formed, neurochemical, irreversible. It changed the worm's biology and to a lesser degree the bonded individuals, not in a harmful way. In a way the document described with the flat language of science and the careful distance of people writing about something they planned to destroy. The bonded worm could not be separated from its chosen individual without severe physiological distress, organ failure within days, death within a week. The document noted this as a logistical complication in the harvesting program. The solution, implemented from the program's early years, was to harvest the worms before the bond could form. Captive hatchlings were kept in isolation from the moment of emergence. No contact, no comfort, no opportunity. Solara had not come from a hatchery. She had come from somewhere wild. She had survived. And she had crawled through a storm to a shed on a human colony world, and a man had come in from the dark and stayed. Reed sat with the document for a long time. Then he called Brine. "You read it," Brine said. "Where did you find it?" Old Conclave archive node on Paris Station. The file was flagged for deletion in their system cleanup 6 years ago, but their archive tech is sloppy. There are hundreds of documents like it. Different creatures, different programs, all pointing the same direction. Brine's voice was careful. "Reed, the bond has already formed. you understand what that means. It means she can't be taken. It means if they take her, she dies, and based on what that document describes, what happens to you isn't much better. They'd call it a medical complication. File the paperwork, move on. Reed looked at the back room door. Through it, barely visible, the soft gold glow of Solara sleeping. You need to run, Brian said. I can get you transit documents. Old Hall routes. Conclave has gaps in their scan coverage out past the Olin Belt. You take her, you go quiet, you disappear. And what happens to Duskfall Station when Olvain decides I ran? Brian didn't answer. She levies the treaty violation against the colony, Reed said. Sable and every family out here loses their land charter. I know how this works. I've seen what Conclave does to colonies that inconvenience them. So what's the other option? I stay. The line was quiet. I stay, Reed said again, and I make it impossible to do this quietly. Olvain had not been idle. While Reed read and called and thought, her team had set up on the road into the colony's center, not on private property, staying carefully within treaty bounds, but visible, present, a message without words. She had also, Reed would learn later, detained a member of the alien press corps who had asked a question she didn't like. The journalist's name was Talori. She worked for a conclave-wide news outlet with readership across 30 member species. She had been embedded with Olvain's team as a routine field correspondent, filing procedural pieces about Harvest Authority operations. The question she asked, quietly, over her personal comms, not on any broadcast, was whether there was any confirmation of a Bond event. Olvain had her comms seized and put her in a holding cabin on the ship. Talori was not new to this. Before the seizure went through, she had already sent one message. 4 words to her editor on Conclave Central: Worm is bonded, confirm. She did not know yet that the message had gone out. She sat in the holding cabin and waited, because Talori was the kind of journalist who had been in worse places and was patient. Reed did not know about Talori yet either. What he knew was that Solara had woken up and come to find him, and was now leaning against his leg the way she had leaned against the wall of his shed, not for warmth this time, but for something harder to name. She had been watching him read. She had been tracking his mood all morning, he realized. When he tensed, she stilled. When he went quiet, she went still too, and her scales shifted, not brighter, but darker at the edges, like she was trying to be smaller, less visible. Protecting him from a threat she couldn't fight, by making herself harder for others to find. Reed put his hand on her back. Nobody's taking you anywhere, he said. It was not a plan, it was not a strategy. It was a statement of intent, and something in how he said it, the particular flatness of a man who had already decided and was done deciding, made Solara lift her head and look at him. Then came the knock at the door. Reed opened it to find Sergeant Brine standing on his step, with 2 rifles slung over one shoulder and a case of ration packs under the other arm. This is the stupidest thing I've ever agreed to, Brine said. I didn't ask you to agree to anything, Reed said. Exactly, Brine walked in. Move over, I need to see what she looks like. Solara regarded Brine from across the room for about 4 seconds, then went back to leaning on Reed's leg. Brine looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the rifles down and opened the ration packs. Right, he said, what's the plan? Nobody called a meeting. That was the part Reed kept coming back to later, when people asked him how it happened. Nobody organized anything. Nobody sent out a message on the colony channel saying, come stand outside Reed Calloway's fence at midday. It just happened, the way things happen in small places where everyone knows everyone and information travels by word and window, and the habit of watching your neighbor's land, because one day you might need them to watch yours. By mid-morning, there were 40 people outside his property line. By noon, there were over 200. They brought nothing dramatic. A few people had tools still in their hands from whatever they had been doing when they heard. Sable, the colony administrator, arrived in her work coat with dust on her boots and stood at the front of the group without saying anything, because she had decided on the walk over that she did not need to say anything. Reed came to the door when he heard the size of the crowd. He stood on his step and looked at them. "You don't have to be here," he said. Sable said, "We heard the broadcast." That was all she said. She did not explain further. She did not need to. Reed looked at the crowd, people he had lived alongside for 11 years, people he had nodded to at the supply depot and helped dig out after the last bad storm and never been close to but always understood. They were not there for him specifically. He knew that. They were there because 40 years of treaty membership and still being treated like a temporary presence on their own land had been building toward something, and this was the thing it had built toward. Olvain's response came within the hour. Her team moved to the edge of the crowd, not into it, not yet, and her field officer gave the standard dispersal notice over a handheld broadcast. The crowd did not move. It did not chant or wave signs or push forward. It stood there in the specific way of people who had decided they were standing somewhere and did not intend to move, and that specific quality of stillness was harder to answer than noise would have been. The bounty hunters on the colony's edge powered up their equipment. The crowd watched them. Nobody fired. The math was wrong for it. 200 humans with no weapons and no apparent fear, and several active press drones from the alien media corps. Talori's colleagues had arrived looking for their missing correspondent, made it the wrong moment to open fire if you needed things to stay clean. Olvain contacted Reed directly, private channel, off broadcast. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone who had been controlling things for a very long time and was very good at it. She offered him a resettlement grant. She offered him a clean record, any outstanding colonial fees cleared. She told him she understood the attachment. She had seen it before, but the creature was property under 16 different conclave legal instruments, and there was no version of this that ended with the human keeping the worm. Reed listened to all of it. Then he said, "She chose me. I'm not correcting that." A pause. "You are one man," Olvain said, "on a fringe colony with no legal standing, no political connections, and no way out that doesn't go through my ships." "I know," Reed said. "I'm still not correcting it." He closed the channel. He did not know until Brian told him 30 seconds later that the private channel had not been as private as Olvain believed. Brian had intercepted and rerouted it through the colony's emergency broadcast at some point in the last 90 minutes. Every word Reed had just said was now on the colonial comms grid. Outside, the crowd had heard. The number was closer to 300 now. Solara had been inside the entire time. Reed had not planned for what happened next. He had not planned any of this. He had simply refused to do the one thing that would have made it stop, and everything else had happened around that refusal. She came to the door on her own. She pushed it open with her good leg, walked through it, and stood beside Reed on the step. She was small. She was still healing. Her glow in the daylight was subtle, the violet threads running through gold, a soft pulse with each breath. The pressed drones turned toward her like flowers toward light. She pressed her side against Reed's leg and stood there. 300 humans looked at a gold and violet creature, the size of a large dog, standing beside one of their own, and nobody on Olvain's side moved. The images went out on the conclave press grid in the next 4 minutes. By the time Olvain's communications officer told her what was happening, it was already on 14 major networks. 43 minutes later, a message arrived from Conclave High Command, not to Reed, not to the colony, but to Olvain's ship directly. The field team was instructed to stand down and await further communication. The bounty hunters received their standby payments and left. They had not been contracted to start a galactic incident. Olvain's ships did not leave. Reed noticed that. Brian noticed it too. The director did not leave. Her ships held position in orbit. The field team pulled back to the colony's edge but did not board their transports. This was not over. Reed knew it the same way he had known storms coming as a cargo hauler, not from any single sign, but from the quality of the silence that preceded them. This quiet had that quality. But for now, the crowd outside his fence began to slowly move apart. Sable walked up his path, shook his hand once without ceremony, and walked back toward town. Reed sat on his step. Solara climbed into his lap, which was awkward because she was too large for it, and settled with her neck over his shoulder, and her amber eyes tracked the horizon where Olvain's ships were still visible as bright points against the afternoon sky. She was watching them. Reed let her watch. Talori had been in the holding cabin for 19 hours when they let her out. Not because Olvain wanted to, because Talori's editor had escalated the missing correspondent report to the Conclave Press Freedom Council, who had escalated it to the Conclave's legal oversight body, who had sent a quiet formal notice to Olvain's ship that unlawful detainment of a registered press member carried consequences that nobody wanted attached to an operation already receiving too much attention. Olvain let her out. Talori walked off the ship, found her equipment where they had stored it. They had not deleted anything, which was either sloppy or arrogant, and she suspected both, and spent the next 6 hours writing. The piece ran on every major Conclave news network simultaneously, not because Talori had that kind of individual pull, but because her editor understood what they had and made sure it reached every distribution node before anyone could apply legal pressure. The headline, translated to human standard, read, "What the Harvest Authority knew and buried, the bond, the worms, and 40 years of classified deaths." Reed read it on his secondary screen while Brian read it over his shoulder and said nothing for a very long time. The piece was thorough. Talori had built it from 3 sources: the classified biological document Brian had found and that had quietly spread to other networks in the hours after Reed forwarded it to his contacts, interviews with former Conclave Biological Survey staff conducted over her 6 hours of work, and a previous 8 months of investigation she had not yet published, and the archived records of 73 individuals across 11 species who had last been documented in contact with Conclave living asset operations and subsequently disappeared from all public records. The Conclave had known since the beginning. The bond was documented. The consequences of separation were documented. The solution, pre-bond harvesting from isolated hatchlings, was policy. And when wild worms with existing bonds were captured, the protocol for the bonded individual was classified under a designation that translated, roughly, as containment termination. 73 individuals, across 40 years, across 11 species, gone. By the time Reed finished reading, 3 Conclave member worlds had issued formal statements demanding an independent audit of the Harvest Authority. 2 others had suspended their institutional support for Conclave biological asset programs pending review. The legal challenge came from an unexpected direction. A scholar named Voss, an elderly academic at the Conclave Institute of Living Systems, had been watching the story develop and had gone into his research archives. He found a clause in the original Conclave Biological Protections Accord, written 600 years ago by a species called the Rendari, who understood bonded creatures better than anyone. The clause stated that a bonded living creature and its bonded individual constituted, under law, a single protected unit. Neither could be processed, relocated, or separated without the legal consent of both parties. The clause had never been repealed. It had simply been buried. Voss published his finding. Within hours, 17 legal scholars had confirmed it. Within a day, the first formal petition had been filed by a coalition of Conclave member world legal bodies. Solara was not property. She was a bonded individual in a protected unit with her chosen partner. The Harvest Authority had no legal jurisdiction over her. Olvain came to Reed's door that evening. Not with her team, alone, out of uniform. She stood on his step and he opened the door and did not invite her in, and she did not ask to come in. "You don't understand what you've done," she said. "I found an injured animal in my shed," Reed said. "I helped it." That injured animal is the centerpiece of a program that funds 16 Conclave medical industries. The worm population in our facilities, 42 individuals, is everything. There are no wild worms. There were not supposed to be any wild worms. Where she came from is a problem I have been managing for 4 years, and you have just made it impossible to manage." Something in what she said snagged in Reed's thinking. He looked at her. "Where she came from," he said slowly, "you've known there were wild worms." Olvain said nothing. Her expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, the particular stillness of a person who has just said more than they meant to. "How many?" Reed said. She turned and walked back down the paths. Reed stood in the doorway and watched her go. Behind him, Brian made a sharp sound and pulled up a data screen. "Reed," Brian's voice had changed. "Brian's contact at the Conclave Survey Division just sent something. A researcher named Davil. She's been quietly cross-referencing Olvain's operational travel logs with her own classified expedition records from the last 4 years." He read for a moment. "Reed, there are more worms, at least 14 confirmed in wild space. Olvain has been running quiet operations to track them for years. She wasn't trying to bring them in. She was making sure nobody else found them." Reed stared at the door Olvain had just walked through. The Conclave's monopoly on auric worms was not just built on controlled breeding. It was built on hiding the fact that the wild population had never truly died. Keep the supply scarce, keep the value absolute, keep anyone from asking what happened to the people who got too close. Reed looked at Solara, who had been sitting quietly in the middle of the room through all of this, watching him think. 14, he said. Solara's scales shifted. Not alarm, something more complex, the glow deepening in the violet threads, spreading slow and steady through the gold. 14, Reed said again, quieter. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought settled in that would not move. Those 14 worms were out there in wild space, alone, and the Conclave knew exactly where they were. That needed to change. 6 months later, the light over Duskfall Station came in at the low angle it always did in late season, gold and long, stretching out across the yard, and the repaired fence, and the new outbuilding Reed had put up, because the original shed was now, apparently, a landmark. He was fixing a pressure coupling when he heard the wings. Solara landed in the yard with the controlled weight of something that had spent 5 months learning how to do it properly, and she was large now, not enormous, not yet, but large enough that her landing moved the dust in a wide ring and made the fence posts shudder. Her scales in the afternoon light were extraordinary. He had never quite gotten used to them. She folded her wings and came over and put her head against his shoulder, which was her current method of greeting him, which had replaced the previous method of sitting on his feet. "You're late," Reed said. She exhaled against his collar. He felt the warmth of it. Brian arrived 20 minutes later, came around the back of the house without knocking. He had stopped knocking about 4 months ago and sat down on the spare crate with 2 cups of something that passed for coffee on Duskfall. "Olvain's trial starts next month," Brian said. "I know. You're listed as a witness." "I know that too." Brian held out a cup. Reed took it. Solara tracked the movement with one amber eye and then looked back at the horizon, where she had apparently found something interesting in the distance. "Voss's coalition got the legal protection confirmed," Brian said. "Full conclave legislative ratification. Bonded pairs as protected units. Takes effect across all member worlds in 90 days. Reed nodded. He had read that. He read everything now, not because he wanted to, but because it kept coming, the steady river of consequence that had started with one night in a shed and showed no sign of stopping. The 14 wild worms had been located and placed under joint protection, a council of member world observers, human colonial representatives included, had been assembled within weeks of Talori's second peace, the follow-up that named Olvain's suppression operation in full detail. The survey team that went out to document and protect the wild population had been careful. They had moved slowly. They had brought no harvesting equipment. 8 of the 14 had bonded during the survey. The bonding was not forced. It was, as the old Rendari clause described, a choice, the worm's choice, made in a moment of vulnerability met with the right response. 8 of those who responded the right way were human. Reed thought about that sometimes. He thought about what it meant that humans, more than any other species on the survey team, had sat quietly with an injured thing and not tried to own it or run from it or file a report first. He thought about whether that said something good or just something particular about the kind of person who goes to the fringe and stays. He thought it was probably both. Talori came by in the afternoon. She did every time she was on Duskfall, which was often enough now that Sable had given her a press residency permit just to simplify the paperwork. She was working on something long, a full account, the kind that takes a year to write and outlasts the moment it describes. She sat in the yard and watched Solara for a while without saying anything. "She's grown," Talori said finally. "She has. How's the leg?" "You'd never know," Reed said. Solara chose this moment to take 3 running steps across the yard and launch herself into the air, a sudden burst of gold and violet against the pale sky, ascending in a long arc toward the ridge east of the colony. She was gone in under a minute. Talori watched her go with the expression of someone still deciding how to put something into words. 3 more colonies have filed shelter exemptions under the Duskfall precedent, she said. A 4th is drafting one. There's a movement in the Conclave legal community to extend the exemption principle beyond wildlife to any living entity that seeks refuge. They're calling it the Callaway Standard. Reed drank his coffee. Tell them to call it something else. They won't. Then they'll do it wrong. Talori smiled. She made a note. Reed did not ask what the note said. Sable stopped by at dusk, not for any official reason, just the way people stopped by now, because the property had become a place people passed through. She told Reed that the colony's treaty status had been formally upgraded. Maori rights, land permanence protections. It had been buried in a legislative amendment, passed in the same session as the bonded pairs protection, mentioned in no major broadcast. Just a clause in a document, changing something that had needed changing for 40 years. They didn't announce it, Sable said. No, Reed said. Probably hopping, nobody noticed. People will notice, Reed said. They always do. Sable nodded. She left. The sun dropped behind the ridge. The temperature fell the way it always did on Duskfall, fast, honest, no gradual suggestion of evening, just full dark coming in behind the light. Solara came back when the first stars appeared. She landed lighter this time, practiced, and came to where Reed was sitting on the step and arranged herself in the way she had developed, too big for his lap, but unwilling to acknowledge it. So she put her head across his knee and let the rest of her take up as much of the step and yard as it needed. Reed sat with his hand on the side of her neck and read his book. The glow of her scales in the dark was warm and steady, not the dim survival light of the first night, not the anxious flicker of the early days, but something settled and permanent, a thing that had found its place and stopped being afraid of it. He had not set out to change anything. He had found something small and hurt, brought it in from the storm, and given it breakfast. He had refused one wrong thing and then another. And the rest had happened around that refusal the way water shapes itself around a stone, not because the stone intends anything, but because it is simply there and does not move. The conclave was still processing the implications. 14 scholars were still arguing. 17 coalitions were still meeting. A trial was still being prepared. Reed turned the page. Solara sighed against his knee, warm and slow, and her scales went gold deep in the dark, and somewhere above them, through the clear duskfall sky, the stars went on and on.